This is another video in the series that is designed to help you give valuable information to Jehovah's Witnesses so that they can make an informed decision about their religious beliefs. It is intended to do for the witnesses what you would want done for you if you were a witness. As I mentioned before in the first video, this is a series of going through this book that witnesses want to go through. It's called, What Does the Bible Really Teach? And most of this book is acceptable within the evangelical community. It's tolerated or accepted, but about 2 to 3% of it is not. It's outside of the conservative evangelical community. And I'm focusing on those words and sentences so that if you were to go through this book with one of the Jehovah's Witnesses and you went through it paragraph by paragraph, you could passively listen and answer the questions as you go along. However, certain parts you have an opportunity to bring more to the attention of the witness that's studying with you. We are coming to page 51 in their book, and in paragraph 12, near the top of the paragraph, it says this, speaking of Jesus, he experienced harsh whipping, cruel impalement, and an agonizing death on a torture stake. Then on the next page is this picture. You see, Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe that Jesus died on a cross-shaped object, but he died on a pole with his hands above his head and then the sign above his hands. And they have a firm position that to think of the cross as the object he died on is wrong. They claim it has that this cross that Jesus died on has a pagan origin, and that shape has a pagan origin, and Christians are not to use it and not to use it as a memory aid for this significant event, which Jehovah's Witnesses do agree is a very significant event. Well, there's a problem with that, and you can bring this up by asking a question. You say, you know, my religious community or my religious upbringing looks at this differently. They believe that the construct that Jesus died on had the shape, if you were to look at it from a distance or look at its shadow, would have a cross shape to it. Because it was a single pole, and then another pole that was crosswise across the top like a capital T, and then above his head would be the name, and that combination, actually there would be 3 poles of the fixed pole, a cross pole, and then a pole holding up the sign behind. So there's 3 poles, and this makes a cross shape if you were to look at it from a distance. And that's what my community has taught me, and I'm wondering how you see it. I see what the paragraph says here, and it mentions something in the appendix. And I'd like to understand that better, because my community says that the pole, there was 1 pole, a 2 pole, and 3 poles. And I was wondering if you could comment, were there 3 poles? I've looked at the appendix of your book, and it says that the Greek word stauros means pole. And my community would agree with that there was a fixed pole, and then another one that he carried out of Jerusalem, and a small, long, skinny one that had the name attached to it that the soldier carried out from Jerusalem. And I'd like to understand that better. And I'd also have a question of if it was a single pole, how did they get Jesus up on the pole? And how did they get him down? Did they cut the pole down, or did they, how did they do that? I'd like to understand that. And let the witness explain, because here is what scholarship says today. If you look at the account of Jesus' execution, we find out that there was a sign that was placed above his head. That's from Matthew 27:37. Then John 20:25 mentions where Thomas says after the resurrection, he says, I will not believe in it unless I can see the prints of the nails in his hands. It doesn't say the print of the nail in his hands. It says the prints of the nails in his hands. So implying that there was 2 nails, 1 for each hand, which would be something like this. So that scripture comes into play. Then Luke 23:26 says that when Jesus is in Jerusalem, they placed upon him the stauros, or pole. How did they place the pole on him? And how big was that pole? I went to a hardware store and I looked for a pole the size of what Jehovah's Witnesses say. And so you would ask, how big was that pole? And they'll tell you, and you figure out how long it was, because it had to be long enough to go into the ground and be stable during an earthquake. Because you remember, after Jesus' death, there was an earthquake, and the pole didn't fall over. Also, the pole had to be tall enough for Jesus to put his hands above his head and the sign above his hands. And if you recall, when Jesus was there being executed and he wanted something to drink, the soldier put a sponge on the end of a long stick or reed and passed it to Jesus' mouth. So Jesus' mouth was high up above the ground. If you figure out how long that pole must have been, and it was big around enough to nail hands and feet, the weight of this pole would be about 300 pounds. If you check with, go to a hardware store that has big enough poles, or you check with a horse corral, a wooden horse corral, those poles are long enough. They're about 300 pounds. So how could they place this pole on Jesus as recorded in Luke 23:26? Also, another issue you can ask is, doesn't God allow us to remember special events with artifacts? For example, in Joshua 4, verse 8, God had the Israelites remember this event of crossing the Jordan with rocks that were taken from the Jordan. It seems that God is not opposed to artifacts. Hebrews 13:10 says that we have the freedom to partake from an altar, to eat from an altar. What altar is that? Well, what altar did Jesus die on? He died on an object that Hebrews 13:10 says it calls an altar. So we'd like to understand how this works out. Mainstream Christianity says that there was a fixed pole out at the execution site. It wasn't put up, taken down, put it up, taken down, put up, chopped down, whatever. It was, a hole was dug, it was placed, and there it stayed. While the victim who is being executed, he carries another pole. It too is a stauros, it's a pole. And they place it on him and they tie his hands this way. This controls the victim. He can't run this way. Not with something that weighs about 100 pounds or 60 pounds on his back. And if he were to fall, it would be very painful. So one guard can control many people using this method of one pole tied across the back. Then when they get out to the execution site, they lay the person down, put in the nails, as we saw in John 20:25, and then the soldiers have a way of lifting the man on each side and placing him on that fixed pole that's upright, making a capital T. Then the soldier that led them out of Jerusalem, he's been carrying a soldier's spear with the name sign above it, tacked to the top. He comes around the backside of the cross, or this capital T, and he straps or nails or attaches this skinny pole, the third pole, and placing the sign above his head. Thus, no need for someone to climb up a ladder, get out a hammer and nail, and tie a hammer on the pole so many feet high up. Not necessary. He just simply attaches his spear and attaches it to the main pole. So that's how they got him up there, and to get him down, they get him down in the same way. They reverse the process of lifting the crossbar, first removing the nail for the feet and bringing down the crossbar. How does the watchtower see Jesus is removed? Good question. Also, this pole, it seems to be awfully heavy. How would someone carry it out of Jerusalem? Another question. While in the Christian view, the pole was already there, and no one carried it out. The cross pole, the smaller one, which was about 60 to 800 pounds, would have been easier to carry. Then finally, bringing out that Jesus' death was a parallel of the Passover. And if you read in Ezekiel 43, verse 20, or Ezekiel 45, verses 19 through 21, it shows that when the Passover was being performed, the high priest would take blood and sprinkle it on the four corners of this wooden altar. Well, for Christians, that is what our high priest did. he placed blood, his own blood, at the one corner where his feet were, at the two corners where his hands were, there was blood, and at the corner where his head was, because he was wearing a crown of thorns. So the first act of our high priest was to sacrifice himself and then to place the blood at the four corners of the altar in parallel to Ezekiel. So you ask a Jehovah's Witness to explain this, and then you say, well, my Christian community has explained it a little bit differently, and I would like to understand how you see it, because the way my community explains it, it seems clearer how the object was set up and how it was taken down, and that from a distance, or the shadow on the ground, it does look like a cross. And I read your appendix, and I don't see the problem with this view. Why would it be a problem? Now, as a Christian, I don't worship the object. I don't venerate it. But I do use it as an object to remember the significant event, just like the Israelites kept those 12 stones from the Jordan to remember the crossing. And after you do that, present it to the witness, saying you would like help to understand their position better. Don't argue with them, just passively listen to their answer and move on to the next paragraph.